I'm Barrie Underwood. I'm a member of the Worle History Society, and I've been researching the police and its early development in the Weston and Worle area. Well, policing started in the form that we now know it in the middle of the 19th century. The Parliament passed the County and Borough Police Act in 1856, and that allowed the local quarter sessions to set up police forces covering the county. Prior to that, there were no county police forces as we would know them. There was only policing in the big metropolitan areas like London and Manchester, and in smaller towns and boroughs that had specifically taken advantage of earlier acts to set up very small local police forces. Yes, we do. Very fortunately, the local newspaper in Weston, the Gazette, published from earliest days the names, uh, rank and number, and their address of the policemen who were assigned to Weston. Initially, in 1856, there was a Sergeant Mears and two police constables, and their names were published in the newspaper week by week. In the early days, there were a lot of changes of staff. Maybe people didn't like the job that they'd signed up for, or for whatever reason, policemen were moved around quite a lot. And it wasn't until about 1860 that things became more settled. By that time, Sergeant John Ross was the officer in charge. There was an acting sergeant as his deputy, and there were by then 5 constables in the town. It must have been very difficult for them. As you say, there were no direct lines of communication, and so they set up quite early on what they called a point system. Under that system, each police officer had his own beat area, very large, covering a number of villages apart from Weston town, and they had pre-arranged meeting times and meeting places. And so it was the policeman's duty, walking his beat every single day, to meet up with the officer covering the next adjoining beat at this predetermined location at the correct time, and there they would pass messages up and down the line. However, if you can imagine, this must have been very, very difficult in the first place. If you wanted to get a message from Weston, where these policemen were based, to the district superintendent, who was based over in Axbridge, it was a torturous thing to do. We don't have details, but I imagine that one of the Western policemen would have needed to walk, because that was the only transport they had, from Weston to possibly Milton at a pre-arranged time, meet the Worle policeman, pass on the message, And the Worle policeman would then walk at least as far as Banwell, possibly a bit further, to meet the policeman who was based at Winscombe, pass the message on, and he'd go home. The Winscombe policeman would then walk the full length of his district, possibly as far as the top of Shelf Hill, where he might meet the Axbridge policeman, pass the message on, the Axbridge policeman would take it back to Axbridge police station. If all went well, they might achieve that in a day, but probably it frequently took longer, particularly if the message couldn't have been arranged to fit in with the normal meeting times, and it might have to wait till the following day, the meeting time of that day. But eventually, that's how they got the message there. The only other way would be by post, which might come the following day, or, exceptionally, they might use the railway telegraph system. Weston was fairly fortunate. Telegraph links along the railway to Worle and to Yatton, and then along the Cheddar Valley line to Axbridge, Cheddar and Wells. So they could send a telegraph message via Yatton to go to Axbridge, or via Yatton and Wells to get to Glastonbury, where the police headquarters was. But that would have been very expensive, and I guess it wouldn't have been used except in case there were really exceptional circumstances, something desperately urgent, because it would have been expensive to do, and the railway company charged for the use of their telegraph network. No, in the early days there were not. Policemen were quite well paid in comparison to everyone else. A police constable in 1860 might earn perhaps 16 or 18 shillings, that's 80 or 90 pence a week. That's about equivalent to £100 a week now, which doesn't sound a lot, but was possibly 3 or 4 times the average wage at the time. But for that, they were on duty all times. They had only one day a fortnight off, 1 week's holiday a year, but otherwise they were expected to be on duty whenever they were called, and they had to be available in uniform all the time that they were up and about. As far as compensation for any injury or any pension was concerned, there was nothing at all. There's a well-known case of a police constable, Alfred Pavey, who worked in Weston. In April 1861, he was on night duty. He got into a fight with 2 other men. He was very, very badly injured. He managed to make it back to the police station, and eventually the case went to court. They caught the people concerned. He was awarded £5 by the magistrates for what they considered to be his courage on the occasion. The police commission gave him a further £3, and the town of Weston, the citizens, the individuals, they all contributed to £35. So he had £43 in total. That's nearly £5,000 in today's money, but that's all he had. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to take advantage of it, as he died from his injuries only 6 months after the attack. He was the first member of the Somerset Constabulary to be effectively killed whilst on duty. Even much later, by the end of the 19th century, provision was not a great deal better. There was a case in 1899 of the superintendent being assaulted inside the police station at Weston-super-Mare, and he was badly injured. He effectively retired, and he was awarded a pension of about £100 a year. That's about £11,000 in today's money. But again, he died relatively soon after his forced retirement, and the pension stopped after only 5 weeks because that was then a year since he'd been assaulted. And so a public subscription had to be raised to help support his wife and his 5 young children, because he died at the age of 43. No, policemen were quite well equipped. Um, they were all issued with a full uniform. They wore normally what was called a frock coat. That's like a very long jacket with a belt around the waist. They had a great coat for the winter wear on top. They were issued with 2 pairs of trousers, boots, 2 pairs of boots, truncheon for self-defense mainly, and a pair of handcuffs. And they also had a top hat. And that was the standard dress that policemen wore for probably the first 25, 30 years that the police force was in existence. Very gradually things changed. By the middle 1870s, they were issued with police helmets that people might be more familiar with these days, but they only wore those during the day, and they were required to wear the top hat at night. Now, Weston, Somerset generally, was fairly well, uh, relatively quiet. There were disturbances from time to time, but nothing terribly violent most of the time. But in other parts of the country, where things were much more difficult, policemen wore a high leather choker collar around their necks inside their uniform to prevent them from being garroted. That's putting a wire or a rope around a policeman's neck and trying to strangle him. And their top hats were lined with steel, which must have made them extremely heavy and difficult to wear, but was some protection against being coshed or beaten over the head.